So, here's a question I've been thinking about a lot lately. Is there a best way to paint with every weapon in Splatoon 3? Like, for some weapons it's really obvious, just point, shoot, and as long as you don't cover the same spot twice, you're golden. But have you ever picked up Octobrush? You can only use this weapon so often before thinking, what is the optimal number of swings I should swing over the same spot before turning or moving on with my life? Here's what I'm getting at. Some of the weapons in this game have very specific methods for maximizing their paint output, and sometimes those methods are convoluted and unintuitive. Luckily, I have over 10 hours in Splatoon 3, so using my amassed wealth of knowledge. Why did I write this? Let's just move on. We're gonna spend some time today going over the best ways to paint with every weapon in the game. Our goal is to kind of demystify some of the more confusing options out there and hopefully to bring something worthwhile to the table for the rest. This should make picking up new weapons a bit easier, and if making this video can get Johnny Aerospray to stop painting like this all game, it will have been worth it. For every weapon, we'll cover all the best painting methods, specifically noting your best options for filling specials, flipping zones, and painting traversable ink. But before getting too into this, there are a couple things that I need to say. Since we've committed to covering every single weapon in the game, a good bit of what we'll discuss is likely common knowledge. But this video exists because many weapons have obscure things that you need to know if you want to maximize your paint with them. I wouldn't have made this if I thought it was obvious how every weapon in the game optimizes its paint. So if there's something overly obvious, I'll try to assume you already know it and just move on. I know this is a video titled Painting Optimally with every weapon in Splatoon 3, but obviously there isn't one specific method that works in every single situation with any given weapon. I'll dedicate a bit of time on each weapon towards detailing every viable option you have, and which methods you should be using in each situation. Just remember that optimizing paint isn't a binary thing, and sometimes you're going to need to decide on your own which method is best for your current position or game state. Also, obstacles. Obviously, there's not a lot of flat, empty space on Splatoon 3's maps. While most of this video was recorded in the practice room, all the painting patterns we talk about today will work in any environment. Some might just take a little bit of creativity. Looking at UL3. There's one more thing that's very much worth saying before we get into this. I'll have information on every single weapon in the game to be sure, but most classes have enough in common that one piece of advice will apply to every single one of its weapons. To avoid repeating that advice ad nauseum, I'm organizing it into a section before each class's individual weapons called Class Info. If you want specific advice to one weapon, I'd recommend going through that section before clicking ahead. Otherwise, you might end up missing something important. So here I go, talking about every weapon in the game for the second video in a row. Just please believe me when I say that I tried to cut out everything I could justify cutting. There will inevitably be times where I tell you things that go without saying or are blatantly obvious. Just try to ignore that. It's a necessary evil if you're making a video like this and trying to be comprehensive. I'm sorry in advance for every time I'm about to do that. But without further ado, let's get started. For shooters, there are 4 different viable painting patterns. Painting strictly for special, left-right panning, up-down panning for lines, and main strafing while painting in a straight line for quick and very specific movement. Different patterns are good in different situations. Obviously, the special fill pattern is only really good for filling special, and the faster your weapon fires and paints, the faster you should turn. Left-right panning is really good for zone flipping and for making traversable ink. Just keep in mind you'll inevitably be covering turf you've already covered. Note that some weapons might prefer one slow pan left or right to covering the same spot twice. And up-down panning is best for quickly creating paths for you and your team to move through while keeping the overall ink coverage high. Main strafing and holding forward is a backup option if you need to move quickly through enemy ink, but it's not providing anything to your team in terms of turf control, so use it sparingly, especially if you're on support. While I've separated these into distinct patterns, there will inevitably be times where you need to combine or swap patterns on a dime. Just keep in mind what each pattern is good for, and those moments should be pretty obvious. Lastly, this goes without saying, but I keep seeing it happening, so I need to mention it. Try to aim straight ahead or lower when your goal is painting, Aiming high will more often than not just give you sparse paint at a lower range, so only do it if you have something very specific in mind, like using the delay in the ink dropping to stall against strikes. Alright, immediately forget everything I said about paint patterns. Sploosh does not need to care. With this weapon, it's as simple as holding the trigger and turning slightly, and that's your best option for everything. You can still do the main strafe hold forward pattern, but only for your own movement, never for turf control. And use curling bomb liberally, it's cheap. Speaking of which, there will be times when curling does the whole main strafing thing a bit better than the main weapon does, so keep that in mind when you need to swim straight in one direction. For Junior, all painting patterns are useful, except maybe the repeated left-right one. Covering the same area twice is less valuable when your range is low. As a result, up-down panning is your best bet for making traversable ink. Just don't get too caught up in exclusively painting. You've got a job to do. That is, unless you're using C Junior, in which case I'd recommend the following inputs. Plus, A, left stick in, down, right 3 times, then A again. That aside, Torpedo paints a ton when it isn't shot down, so if painting is your goal, try to pick targets who have a hard time justifying that course of action, like X-Blow, Splatlings, or Chargers, to name a few. All 4 painting patterns are viable on Splash, but the main gun's paint is so over-tuned that you don't need to prioritize using them in every situation. That doesn't mean they're not worth using, especially if you desperately need to charge a special or flip a zone, you'll find them to be incredibly useful. Just don't forget, you've got a job to do. The same more or less goes for End Splash, but instead your job is painting, filling specials, and throwing suction bombs. Or B-Splash him. Rain? Speaking of which, now's a good time to clarify something. Since the community still hasn't really settled on nicknames for the new weapons, and the given names are kinda hard to remember, here's what we'll be doing for the duration of this video. If it's a Barazushi kit, I'll put a B in front of the weapon name, so Splash becomes B-Splash. And if it's an Embers kit, I'll put an E in front of the weapon name, so Spray becomes E-Spray. Now that that's out of the way, let's get back to the weapons. Spray paints a ton, but it also leaves more gaps than you'd expect. You don't need to use patterns as strictly as you do with most other shooters, just remember to use them whenever your paint has lots of gaps. That being said, all 4 patterns are viable, but considering the range of this gun, your left-right pattern is a little less impactful than it is on other weapons. Don't forget about your kits. All 3 subs are great painting tools, and all 3 specials are an instant ink tank refill, which means you'll have more subs to throw. All 4 patterns are viable on shot, and if you're not using them, you're pretty likely to end up with patchy paint. Even if you do use them, there's a pretty stark contrast between this weapon's paint and the more paint-centric weapons like Splash. Don't be surprised when nothing you do results in perfectly clean swaths of paint. The best you can do is make it as patchless as possible. That being said, you do have specials that are worth paintbotting over, and your subs are busted for everything. While they're pretty costly in terms of ink, shooters don't tend to feel the penalty all that much. With 52 gal, all 4 patterns are viable but for one key exception. The left-right pattern doesn't tend to stack well with this gun, meaning if you're doing it quickly, you'll end up with horribly patchy paint. So I'd recommend prioritizing the up-down pattern for traversability, or just doing one slow pan left or right if you need an area painted. All 4 patterns are perfectly viable on NZAP, just keep in mind that the fire rate is incredibly high, and each shot paints slightly less than you might expect. You'll need to take care with the precision of your shots, even if you're only trying to optimize your paint. All that's left to say is your subs aren't as valuable for painting as your main weapon is, so prioritize using them for more combat-specific purposes instead. And of course, a special with free ink tank refills means more bombs to throw. For Shot Pro, all 4 patterns are viable, but if you use the left-right pattern, pan slowly or you'll get a bunch of gaps in your paint. Likewise, your up-down pattern demands some pretty specific aim to prevent gaps, so take care when you're using it. Also, for Forge, use Suction Bomb always. And something to that effect can be said for every aspect of the new kit. Like with 52 gal, 96's left-right pattern doesn't paint much when you pan over the same area multiple times. You're better off with one slow pan in either direction. The up-down pattern can wind up with gaps as well, but sparse paint is a built-in feature of the 96 gal. Just make sure your aim is relatively precise, and you'll have your straight lines for mobility. The other 2 patterns work just fine for the jobs they're designed for, but unless you're using B96, I don't really recommend prioritizing the special fill pattern. More of these two specials means less time existing as a 96 gal, which typically ends in less playmaking potential. Unless you're a god. With Jet, all 4 patterns are viable, but you'll inevitably leave gaps unless you really take your time with it. The first 2 subs are meaningless for Jet Squelcher's paint, and it's almost always not worth the ink cost, especially for painting. Burst is a whole different story, giving you a much better option for painting walls and behind cover. But it's still worth remembering that you get a bit more mileage out of your ink tank when painting with your main gun. Splashdown and Rain are still solid specials with a free ink tank refill. Don't be afraid to use them for the free ink when you're in a pinch. 99% of the time, don't even bother pushing the vacuum button. You're more valuable to your team when you can shoot. All 4 patterns are extremely viable on Nova, and although there's a few gaps, the gaps themselves make Jet Squelcher look bad. And unfortunately, there's not really anything else to say about the main weapon's paint besides to use all 4 patterns when applicable. When you do manage to get map control, don't forget about setting ink mines down. They're not the best tool for painting the map, but they're one of the best when it comes to keeping the map your color. Alright, for L3 and H3, none of our previously established patterns apply. Your best bet for solid traversable paint with L3 is holding left or right on the control stick and firing repeatedly. This is essentially somewhere between the left-right pattern and up-down pattern in terms of results. Your number 1 enemy for painting with L3 is obstacles in your way. On a flat surface, you have solid paint, but otherwise it's a bit of a struggle. Whatever you do, don't flick left and right when painting with L3. Your paint gets even more sparse, and it's incredibly difficult to work off of whatever paint that places. Lastly, while the main strafing isn't quite on the level of other shooters, L3 can still do something kinda similar. It's a bit of a risky maneuver, but it's far from useless. In terms of stage geometry and obstacles, H3 struggles in the same way that L3 does. To make up for the fire rate, H3 paints a pretty usable swath of turf when it flicks left or right mid-shot. Your only other option is using one burst to fire in a straight line for immediate mobility. Spamming flick shots is better for painting large areas, but a quick line for movement is always a valuable thing to have. For H3, main strafing is essentially gone. And of course, your first 2 kits aren't going to be helping you paint, outside of the ink tank refills they might provide. But if you're picking H3 at this point, it isn't for those kits. It's for this one. And I don't have to tell you how good this kit is for painting. Now, obviously, you shouldn't prioritize painting with Squeezer, but if the job needs doing, you have a painting mode that is worth utilizing. It's not much paint, but it's leaps and bounds better than your tap shots. Surprisingly, with its painting mode, all 4 patterns are viable and honestly worth using. But more often than not, you've got a job to do and painting isn't it. That's it for shooters. Sorry if that was a bit more all 4 painting patterns are viable than you were expecting, but I figure that's better than explaining how every pattern interacts with the nearly identical weapon mechanics between most shooters. Besides, those patterns really are your best bet when it comes to painting with these weapons, at least as far as I can tell. If you've got a better one in your back pocket, you'd better be typing it in the comments right now. Or I'll never know. I'll be a worse player. It'll be your fault. I'll blame you. If you're specifically playing one of these rollers, your best option for paint control is slaying, so keep making that your priority. And for everyone except Flingza, mashing your horizontal swing is the best painting tool you have. That goes for special filling, zone flipping, and making traversable ink. For most of us this goes without saying, but rolling isn't a great way to ink the floor. It's a decent movement tool for getting through enemy ink, and it has other niche applications, but painting isn't one of them. Unless this is you. If you need to paint for special with carbon, your best bet is holding forwards and mashing horizontal flicks. I'd recommend against rolling for filling special, considering how much more you paint with horizontals. Burst Bomb and Auto Bomb don't paint a lot, about 14 to 15 paint per throw, but considering this weapon's range and playstyle, they can be instrumental towards safely filling your special. V-Carbon is a 160 point zipcaster after all, even 15 paint towards that is fairly relevant. But then there's Fizzy Bomb. Even after all the nerfs, this sub paints so much that you can forego using your main weapon altogether and end up with a similar paint output. Plus, the instant ink tank refill on chumps means you'll be throwing even more of them. And of course, if you can safely do it, mashing horizontal flicks over a zone is still somewhat decent in terms of paint coverage. Just keep in mind that you're never more vulnerable as a roller than when you're spamming horizontals in place. That being said, Splat Roller's bubble means you can now set up beside and safely paint a zone by mashing horizontal flicks. Just like with Carbon, your best painting tool is horizontal flick, and it paints the most when walking forwards or backwards and turning slightly left or right in between flicks. Vertical flick takes slightly longer to use and it paints slightly less, but as we've discussed, having a straight line to quickly place and move through is always a good thing. Use Curling Bomb for everything. Movement, approaches, feigned approaches, safe, sustainable paint, special fill, it really does it all for a weapon that sharks and struggles to paint. The paint on Dynamo's horizontal flick varies wildly depending on the angle of your flick. Aiming straight down will paint a small but clean patch of paint. Aim slightly further up and the length, width, and distance increase dramatically, though there is a fall-off point. When looking perfectly ahead, you'll get the maximum distance and paint output your weapon's capable of providing, but your paint gets incredibly sparse. On top of that, this is the point where your horizontal flick's RNG starts to show. Some flicks will inevitably leave paint that is essentially useless for mobility. Aim further up, and if the RNG is in your favor, the paint will be closer together, but over a smaller area. As such, your best bet for traversable Dynamo paint is aiming just a bit below straight ahead. For special filling, aiming straight ahead is ideal and gives you about 10 points of paint more than almost any other angle. The best advice I can give on vertical flick is to use it very sparingly. It's not the worst poking tool from a long range, and it paints a usable straight line, but it is a fairly bad button that puts you at risk almost every time you use it, so again, use it sparingly. Obviously, rolling with Dynamo is a major risk to your health, so only use it if you're all out of options. Or if it's really funny. Lastly, your kits do a lot for you in terms of painting. Both specials offer an instant ink tank refill, which is welcome considering Dynamo's god-awful ink efficiency. The Sprinkler is the perfect painting tool for a weapon that needs its cooler charged ASAP, and you'd be surprised how often it comes in handy for quick movement when throwing it at your feet. The Splat Bomb is good for paint and pretty much everything else. Just keep in mind both subs have a fairly high ink cost, and the Dynamo itself doesn't like being left with only 2 flicks after using them. We don't talk about eDynamo. I know this is gonna sound obvious, but I'm on my hands and knees here. Please, don't roll around with the Flingza when your team needs paint. Flingza Vertical Flick is one of the best painting tools in the game. Whether you want turf control or a full special meter, it's always your best option, and it doesn't put you at risk. You may not know this, but if you land before your vertical flick finishes its startup, you can still move at your normal walking speed. But unlike being in the air, you can change your movement direction on a dime. Like with Dynamo, the angle you're aiming at changes how the vertical flick paints. Aiming lower gives you less distance, but much wider paint. Use this for cleanly filling in cracks when the situation provides. Aiming too high will reduce your painting distance, and aiming straight ahead gives you the furthest fling, but a marginally thinner paint trail compared to the alternatives. So for maximum special fill, flipping zone, or traversable ink, your best bet is always vertical flick, typically when aimed straight ahead. And that goes for the lines painted to the left and right as well. Rolling is still useful as ever for escaping a situation when you're surrounded by enemy ink or under heavy fire, but it's no better at painting than Splat Rollers, and you're the Flingza. So fling.
Isn't that your role?
Also, don't forget about your subs when the time is right. Suction Bomb is good in most situations, and Ink Mine is an amazing tool in the right positions. I talked about this a lot in my paint output video, but Big Swig has to make some tough decisions when it comes to painting. You have one of the best fighting tools in the game with your vertical flick, but it paints extremely poorly, and the best you can do is give yourself a thin, straight line to move through. On the other hand, horizontal flick is one of the best painting tools in the game, but it's a problematic combat tool at best, often leaving you exposed and vulnerable in exchange for dealing 40 damage. So the best advice I can give is to choose your moments and positions carefully. Angles do technically impact the turf you cover with both flicks, but not to a degree that it's relevant. Just aim straight ahead and mash away. That'll be your best bet for special fill and for maximizing traversable ink. Keep in mind that all that paint output comes at a hefty cost, and the only tool in the first 2 kits that lightens the load is Inkstorm's free ink tank refill. But at this point, you're not picking those kits anyways. E-Swig's Splashdown is a free ink tank refill too, only with a much more immediate impact on the game, and Torp is Torp. You don't need me to tell you how versatile it is. Lastly, even with Big Swig, your flicks outpaint your roll. It's less of a crime to paint with Big Swig's roll than any other roller, but it's still far from optimal. But that's rollers. I'd say the biggest thing to note is how much your angle of firing impacts your paint. Also, don't roll for paint. Please. Please. No, you're on my team. I would like to win. Why are you rolling? Why are you... With chargers, fully charging and firing is typically better than a bunch of tap shots, though sometimes tap shots are exactly what you need for movement, painting a zone, or plugging holes. Most chargers also get slightly more paint at the end of their shots if their shot hits the ground before reaching its maximum range, and the amount increases depending on how close the shot lands to the one firing it. More than any other weapon class, chargers have to choose between firing at enemies or inking the ground. Not that you never paint when aiming at other players, rather that the paint usually isn't all that traversable. And don't hold one charge for so long that you could have fired twice by the time you fire once. That's an easy way to end the round with less than 500 paint. That being said, some niche situations will require charge holding, so don't fire instantly 100% of the time. Rather, prioritize one over the other. And the reason I'm saying all of this is that most chargers have fairly valuable specials, and their positioning keeps them alive longest of anyone. Don't let your point and click adventure out-prioritize your special altogether. When you're focused on painting with Squiffer, I'd say you should fully charge 99% of the time, reserving tap shots for filling in the gaps. Your best means of filling special and painting the map is repeatedly charging and firing while holding left or right, sometimes diagonally. In this firing pattern, jumping is entirely optional and works especially well when you're in enemy ink. Bubble might make it easier to paint for some time, but any paint placed while Bubble is active isn't building your next one. Painting with Bubble is a zone control exclusive kind of play, especially when your weapon doesn't have much paint to begin with. For new Squiffer, definitely make liberal use of your auto bomb, but don't use your Zipcaster to paint if you can help it. Zip is incredibly threatening whether or not you can hit your shots, so if this isn't the last 5 seconds of turf war, you're not getting proper value out of your special by using it to paint. After zipping once, you only have between 4 and 5 shots left. This isn't going to make much of an impact in terms of turf control, and definitely not as much as you would hitting other players with those shots. With Splat Charger, your charge time is exactly a second long. It takes about the same amount of time to fill your special with tap shots that it does with charge shots. The only real difference is in ink cost and combat utility. I still recommend charge shots in 99% of situations. It's your best bet for turf control and charging special. Now onto the kits. V-Charger feels the ink cost of a Splat Bomb. You only get about 2 shots after you throw it. Try not to overuse it, but don't ignore it. It is the only tool in your kit, after all. Vacuum isn't real. It can't hurt you. Just as well, Wall is pretty expensive, but you can safely use it and refill your ink tank from your usual position in the back. In the right matchups, using it might be the difference between charging strikes and perishing horribly. Strikes are a free ink tank refill, and you'll be safe enough in the back to use them without fear. So do. As far as B-Charger goes, your special's pretty cheap, and if you're making consistent use of your sprinkler, you'll get tons of them. Just remember not to make too many risky plays when the special meter's almost full. For leader, it takes about twice as long to fill your specials with charged shots than it does with tap shots. I still recommend using charged shots for painting. If you need your special and now, tap shots might make the difference. But I mean, look at these things. You don't need these specials. Your ink mines are more of a personal defense tool than a painting one, but if the situation provides, placing them at mid can be a boon to your team. And if you get your ink mines on zone, it's not a bad idea to spam tap shots when the zone is contested. Mines and tap shots together do a solid job of keeping the zone your color. Bamboo's tap shots can paint a surprising amount if your only goal is filling special. That being said, a charge shot is still better for paint in literally every situation, including special filling and zone flipping. Never use tap shots if your goal is turf control. Just don't do it, to save yourself the trouble. Bamboo paints about the same amount when fully charged as it does at only 75% charge. I'll be honest, I don't know if this one actually matters, but it's good to know. Considering Bamboo's charge time and flexible positioning, it shouldn't be any trouble turfing the map during combat. You have two cheap and incredibly spammable subs on a weapon that isn't exactly hurting for ink efficiency. Use them liberally, especially Fizzy. Both of Bamboo's specials are an instant ink tank refill at worst and a legitimate threat at best, so try to get value out of them when you can. If you've played any amount of GooTuber, you already know that the tap shots are a much better painting tool than the alternative. Plus, you have specials that are worth charging, so please, tap the shots to your heart's content. Honestly, as long as your goal isn't slaying, tap shots are your best bet in every paint-related situation. One thing you should definitely know is how the weapon's charge interacts with its wall paint. A tap shot only gives you a small dot of paint, but even charging to a quarter of your first ring gives you a traversable line beneath it. In terms of range, your charge shots paint about 25% further than your tap shots do, and that's it. 25%. And your one ringed charge paints at almost the same range as your full charge. The only big difference is in the paint's thickness. The most obvious point to make here is that it takes like a second and a half per charge, and the charge does not paint much. You do the math. I will say it's nice that the subs provide more effective range than your main weapon is capable of. I'd honestly recommend using them about as much as you use your main gun. With pencil, your time is extremely valuable. I wouldn't recommend using tap shots to fill in patches. In fact, I wouldn't use them at all for paint, unless 1 or 2 taps alone would fill up your cooler, or if you're desperate to keep a zone your color. Optimally painting for special with pencil is pretty obvious, just don't paint over the same spot twice, nothing else to it really. Why do you think every map in every top level game of zones looks like this? For painting zones specifically, there's not much to optimize outside of firing in a way that leaves the most paint in every shot on the zone. When your goal isn't filling special, zone, or slaying, rare, try to paint in a way that leaves little to no space between your shots, so that your team has maximum mobility. Even 2 shots side by side are a massive improvement to a bunch of thin lines. There's also the hidden tech that swimming while you still have charges gives you back the ink you spent charging. You never know when that'll come in handy. Lastly, don't forget your sprinkler. When your special costs 220, you need every edge you can get if you're hoping to get enough coolers. Sorry if there wasn't anything particularly novel to say about most chargers outside of charged shots outpaint tap shots. I said as much as I could, but at the end of the day, charger paint is always a straight line, and that's something you can only split so many hairs over. A lot of the strategy in creating traversable slosher paint is making sure that your subsequent paint patches land a bit further forwards or backwards relative to the previous shot. Alternating the distance while strafing left or right will make the most traversable paint Bucket is capable of providing, but that's only for traversable paint. For filling special, it's almost always the same old never paint the same spot twice technique. For holding zones with most buckets, I'd recommend alternating between 2 sloshing spots on the zone that you can hit from one position. Usually buckets don't paint all that much, so you won't make much headway firing at the same spot on repeat if you're up against a splash player. There's also this odd height-based mechanic that impacts pretty much every bucket in the game. If you're higher up, the burst at the end of your paint will be slightly smaller than it otherwise would be. Note that this only happens when you yourself are high up, not if you only aimed high up. That being said, the difference is typically negligible, so I wouldn't lose your head over it. Alright, let's start with the basic bucket. Something you should probably know about this weapon is that the range is a little ambiguous. The angle you're aiming at can affect how far the hitbox reaches. For maximum distance, aim about 15 degrees above straight ahead. This doesn't impact the distance your paint travels, unless your shot hits someone that it wouldn't otherwise be hitting at its normal range. While Bucket can flick to change the path your paint makes, I can't think of a single time I've seen this make a difference. At best, it can be used to fill in corners or to give you a bit more ink to move around in your immediate area. But that's really it. One of Bucket's more niche mechanics is that the end of your sloshes paint more if they hit the ground before reaching their max range. Not by much, but enough that it's noticeable and applicable in the right places. That's going to be the case with some other sloshes as well, and it's worth noting that it paints the largest possible patch if you aim straight down at your feet. But this strategy does lose out on the paint you get from the sloshes trail. In terms of painting with Bucket itself, I'd recommend a couple different things. For personal pathing, quickly painting a straight shot makes perfectly traversable ink and with very solid frame data. Short hopping can keep you mobile while you're sloshing, and it's always a good idea so long as you're not planning on sloshing twice. For traversable team paint, I'd recommend using the diagonal pattern we discussed in the class info section, and for special paint, it's just your bog standard, don't let any shot hit the same spot twice. Lastly, the kits. Splat Bomb is costly, but with even a single sub of Main Saber, you get a 4th slosh after bombing from a full ink tank. That is to say, you don't feel the loss from throwing a bomb quite as badly as some other weapons do. Both specials are amazing, but you're only really gonna use the Tri-Strike kit, for reasons. Splat Bomb just does too much for you to pass up on. That really is the long and short of it. For Tri, when you're maximizing your special fill, you won't be making particularly traversable paint. I'd recommend using the alternating pattern whenever possible, but more than that, spam those fizzies. If you don't have fizzies, I'd recommend changing kits. Wait, this joke doesn't work anymore. Thanks, Barazushi. Now, is as good a time as any to tell you this. I've been working on this video a long time, about a month and a half. And just when I was about to upload it...
The Splatlings collection! New weapons from the Barazushi and Embers brands is on its way!
So I spent the last week or so editing the script that I had already recorded, and editing the changes in while trying to keep the flow intact. I hope the edits were seamless enough that you didn't notice until now, but let's get back into the swing of things. For the new kit, you don't have to worry as much about farming specials. Your special's actually pretty good in terms of kit synergy. And Splat Bomb is solid for forcing enemy squids into bad positions. It's pretty good for painting too, and with Screen's free ink tank refill, you can use them liberally. But that's it for the kit specifics. With Tri, the lower you aim, the closer together your paint droplets fall. This is good for more traversable paint, but inevitably results in less paint towards your special. Is that like the 5th or 6th inevitably in the script so far? That's a lot of the same word. Lastly, short hopping and swimming in between sloshes can be a good option for mobility. Though, it does cost you some paint per second that you'd otherwise get from standing in place and sloshing or throwing fizzies. Machine's best painting options for special fill and mobility are the same ones we discussed at the beginning of this section, and I don't really have much to add there. Just keep in mind that a direct shot means you'll place a little bit less paint than you otherwise would. But who cares? You hit a direct. Nice. The only other thing to note is that this weapon paints pitifully little. You're gonna get a lot of value out of fizzies, and it always feels good to throw 4 of them back to back thanks to Booyah Bomb's instant ink tank refill. Okay, we need to talk. Nothing I said about the other buckets applies to bathtub. None of it. You have 2 options for bathtub paint, and I have issues with both of them. If you're trying to paint for specials, your best bet is to flick violently after sloshing. This paints the most, but what are you supposed to do for mobility with paint like this? If you want mobility, for you or your teammates, your only real option is to aim straight on like the weapon doesn't have a flick mechanic. This paints a straight line, but most of the paint is hitting spots other blobs just covered, so you lose out on special fill. Really, you should aim for walls and go for rebounds. Odds are that'll result in better paint than anything else Bathtub is capable of, so it's what I recommend for zone flipping. If you have the time, come up with some creative angles yourself for painting on zones maps optimally with Bathtub. I'm sure the blob community will appreciate it. Since the sum of these parts is a weapon with some inconsistent paint, your most reliable option ends up being Sprinkler. So, you know, use it. For Explo, we're going back to our alternating pattern from the other buckets. This is your best bet for making traversable paint. Since you don't have the most valuable specials, and you'll inevitably paint enough to fill them quickly, painting for team mobility should be your priority. Obviously, the explosion of paint is your best tool for impacting turf, but don't sleep on the line painted behind it. An important aspect of maximizing your paint with this weapon is effectively using the turf coverage and mobility this painted line provides, even if it isn't much on its own. For zone flipping, just maximize the paint you place on zone with every shot. It might take some creative positioning to make proper use of the line you paint, but you'd be surprised how much it impacts the zone. Plus, you paint a ton with every shot. You don't have to be too picky with where in the zone you're hitting, outside of aiming where the enemy ink is most abundant. Jumping when you shoot is almost always a good idea. It helps you to reposition and stay moving while painting or fighting. For Explo and no other weapon in the game, you can use short hops and full hops interchangeably. Your sloshing animation will take longer than either jump, so the one that keeps you moving for longer tends to be a bit more useful. But that's not always the case. Constantly full hopping makes you easier to track and predict, so it's worth mixing it up every now and again. Just be aware that any splat bomb thrown at the right time can and will be the end of you if you're jumping for every single shot. I don't usually talk about this for the other weapons since it's not usually all that relevant, but look at this thing's wall paint! Whoa! How does this work? What is happening? All that's left to say is that your specials are ink tank refills, and Splash Wall costs so much ink that you'd better choose your usage opportunities very carefully. I mentioned earlier that some buckets paint more at the end of their sloshes if they hit the ground before your ink starts falling straight down. This affects Dread as well, but the difference is very slight, and you still paint so much without it that I'd honestly recommend against forcing yourself to take advantage of it with every shot. You're better off focusing on the accuracy of your flicks. This goes without saying, but if you flick hard enough, you can have both sloshes fall on completely different stretches of turf. This is your best option for painting zones, filling special, and making traversable ink. For optimal coverage, flicking in the same direction multiple times leaves ink with minimal gaps. Do it in opposite directions and you're liable to create this pretzel-shaped thing that covers a couple spots twice over. And while you definitely paint more with a flick, sometimes you just need a clean line to swim through. Foregoing the flick gives you exactly that post-haste. This is also one of those buckets that prefers to short hop in between shots for repositioning and moving through enemy ink. Use it often, but not exclusively, or you might end up in the same situation we discussed with Explo. Lastly, it's worth mentioning the kits. Until only recently, I was gonna say kit. You know why. But now we have 2 viable Dread kits, so I can't make that joke anymore. For that new kit though, you might think curling on Dread is only really good for special fill, since Dread doesn't struggle to keep itself mobile and curling isn't much of a combat sub, but you'd be surprised how consistent curling is for getting you out of a bad position and into a better one. And this kit has the funniest viable curling combo known to man. There's not much I can say about Crab besides that Dread gets a ton of them, but it's dawning on me now that I haven't really talked about using Crab for paint. The special is clearly better for locking down a position and slaying, but the rapid fire and built-in Explo shot are still crazy in terms of paint. You never know when they'll be useful for holding or flipping a zone. For V-Dread, obviously the bulk of your paint isn't concentrated into Suction Bomb, but you should still make use of it where you can. Just keep the ink cost in mind and you'll be alright. Reef Slider. Reef Slider. Reef Slider. Reef Slider. And that's it for buckets! I'd say the most important things to remember are the alternating patterns and making use of the painted line that follows your every slosh. Forgive me if most of this stuff is common knowledge, but the little bit that wasn't, I had no choice. Either I cover everything or risk being incomprehensive. I couldn't do that to you. What if Johnny Aerospray's watching and we only gave him like half the information he needed to succeed? We do it for him. Guess what? They're back. And better than ever. All 4 painting patterns from the shooter class are just as applicable for Splatlings, with one key exception. Technically, you can do the main strafing pattern that shooters do, but especially if you're surrounded by enemy ink, you'll likely take a ton of damage touching the ground in between shots. In this worst case scenario, you can jump and use tap shots for a quick movement option that might just save your life. It's also useful for painting ledges in between doing a squid surge and landing. Going forward, when I say all 4 painting patterns are viable, just assume that this tap shot maneuver replaces your typical main strafing pattern. At least for the rest of the Splatlings. If your goal is zone flipping, the shape of the zone will usually demand that you mix up and combine a couple different patterns to fully paint the zone before running out of charge. And this goes without saying, but Splatlings only get their maximum range after reaching at least 1 ring of charge. But you knew that already. Look at you go. The last thing worth mentioning about all the Splatlings is this: don't be afraid to use your partial charges. Even Edit can get a ton of value out of its partial charge in terms of paint and DPS. Though some Splatlings may have a harder time making that commitment than others. Hydra and Edit would obviously prefer to be fully charged if they can help it, while on the other end, Mini charges so fast that you can typically stand to wait a couple more frames and get a full charge off. Still, don't sleep on partial charges. It's a part of your kit, not that kind of kit, and you're missing out if you never take advantage of them. Like a few of the game's shooters, Mini's paint is so overtuned that you don't really need to take advantage of the painting patterns to do a good job. That being said, you'll still find myriad opportunities to make use of all four, and they're worth using for optimizing your paint output. Also, with how much paint per second Mini provides, a single slow pan to the left or right typically outdoes quickly panning back and forth multiple times. All that's left to say is that Mini's kits do a lot for your paint. More than almost any other bubble user, the extra effective range bubble affords Zimmy makes this weapon a menace in zones. And ever since Ultra Stamp became a tactical nuke, Vimy has a special that's almost worth paintbotting over. Usually burst bombs go a long way in terms of impacting your paint output, but with Vimy's insane main weapon paint, they're more of a utility and team play tool than anything else. Use them to paint distant lands or walls if you're not in a combat situation where they're already applicable. Bimmy, yes, we're calling it Bimmy now, isn't gonna be providing any paint with its beacons, but this is still Mini Splatling we're talking about. There isn't a sub out there that could hurt this weapon's painting power. And while Zuka doesn't paint all that much, this gun can farm a single Zuka in 10 seconds with no special charge. If you ask me, that alone is enough reason to pick this kit. With Heavy Splatling, there's a strange phenomenon that the two kits make abundantly clear. With this weapon's low charge time and high paint output, the vanilla kit's sprinkler and instant ink tank refill make Heavy seem like a weapon with insane painting power. But take those tools away, and it gets painfully obvious that the weapon's paint isn't particularly crazy on its own. As much as I like saying hecko, the kit has what is essentially negative synergy. You don't want your backline to stop backlining for 10 seconds, and the value you get from point sensor is offset by its cost, impacting your uptime even further. What I'm getting at is this: Heavy can paint, but it struggles to reach its potential individual of its kit. Kinda like the situation with Tri-Stringer's two kits. That is to say, use your kit wisely. Even if it's Wavebreaker Sprinkler, you can get a ton of value out of a kit like this if it's being properly utilized. Other than that, all four painting patterns are viable and worth using. Going forward, it's worth saying that Splatlings and their limited uptime get more value from employing these patterns than pretty much all shooters do. You only have so many shots per charge, so making sure that everything that needs doing is done by the end is a must. So you know how I've been saying partial charges can do a lot for you in terms of paint?
Not this time.
With the Hydra, you use partial charges in one situation and one situation only. You're not finished charging, but you're being rushed down and need to defend yourself. The paint on partial charge is
Completely useless.
unless you count one ring of charge as partial, because Hydra's one ring charge is every bit as good at painting as its fully charged one is. But if you're already one ring charged, there are very few situations where you shouldn't be charging fully, considering how quickly the second ring charges. All that aside, with how long it does take to charge, it's more important than ever to use your uptime wisely. The first three painting patterns are a proper means to that end, and the fourth is pretty much the most versatile movement option in your kit. The left-right pattern paints some surprisingly traversable ink at your maximum range, so I'd recommend using it on rollout. But that's it for Hydra-specific painting info, and I don't know how to say this, but your kits have a tendency to get in the way. At least the first two. This one's clean. While mines and autobombs are fairly cheap as far as subs go, the ink cost means even more downtime on one of the downtimeanest weapons in the game. At least mines have no white ink frames and a special that insta-fills your ink tank, but Booyah Bomb can seriously hurt your tempo, even if it's the better special. If you want more in-depth talk about how tempo can impact your paint, I have a very long video about it on this channel that I think you'd enjoy. Speaking of the paint output video, we spent a lot of time there talking about the paint you place through combat. And unlike the other Splatlings, Ballpoint has to choose between painting and fighting in a binary sort of way. It's a lot like Squeezer. Yeah, your long-range mode places paint on the map, but the amount that it paints is among the worst paint per second in the game. If you do plan on painting in the long-range mode, the painting patterns are a necessity if you want to make any traversable ink whatsoever. Specifically the left, right, and up-down patterns, considering that painting for special and movement is already well covered by your short-range mode. As for short-range mode, remember when we talked about Sploosh and how it paints so well at its range that you don't need any patterns? That applies to ball paint. Ball paint? That applies to Ballpoint's short-range mode too. You'll be committing to only affecting the area adjacent to you, but that paint output on what is essentially a bottomless clip is worth it. Just keep in mind, you've got a job to do, and that job is long-range mode. All Splatlings hate taking time out of their day to use subs. That's time you could have spent charging or shooting, and now you've got to spend it filling your ink tank. This is Fizzy's worst attribute, considering that it takes even more time to shake before throwing. Luckily, mines have no white ink frames, but they do have a vacuum stapled to them. Don't pick that kit for any competitive situation, but do pick it for fun. It's one of my favorite kits in the game. It's just a blast to use. In exchange for being able to charge mid-shot, swim while charged, and all these other crazy Nautilus-specific mechanics, this gun runs out of charge faster than any Splatling that isn't mini. Despite this, Naut has some of the best paint in the entire weapon class. The real dilemma is that Naut is typically better used for its fighting capabilities instead of its paint support. You can paint, but that might not be your primary role in the team comp. And of course, if you're focused on painting, you might start feeling held back by the range of the weapon. All that's left to say is that Nautilus cares a lot about how much ink is left in the tank. That's your reserve charge. For this reason, regularly using your subs might be a bit of a tough sell. At least point sensor doesn't hit your ink tank too hard, and it's always nice to have two specials that instantly refill your ink tank. Most heavy edit players paint almost exclusively in its fully charged state, and with good reason. While the full charge runs through its charge much faster, you paint as much per shot as the other levels of charge. The only difference is in time spent firing, where a fully charged edit dumps its clip 1.5 times as fast as any other level of charge. So yes, in terms of paint per second, repeatedly charging to full and emptying the clip is your best bet. However, there are times throughout every game where spending all that time charging isn't worth the opportunity cost. For instance, if you could have used a partial charge to finish filling special and spawn, the time that'd save getting to mid might be the difference between life and death for your teammates. Don't fully charge in every single situation where paint is the priority, but do attempt to use it more often than not. Edit's partial charges are filthy for combat, but that's not today's topic. Just know that they're far from useless for painting, especially after one ring of charge. As far as painting patterns, all 4 are applicable to heavy edit, but through all of them, your #1 priority should be farming special. And while tap-shotting for mobility through enemy ink is still viable for edit, Curling Bomb does the job a bit better, so if you have the ink, don't be afraid to use it as an escape tool. That's it for Splatlings. I know we're doing the all 4 painting patterns are viable thing again, but this time there's been a lot more worth discussing. Can you tell I use these weapons like all the time? The theme of this class is actually use partial charges. Get out there, pick up Hecko, and scare the shit out of someone who's expecting a free kill when your Kraken runs out. Now, for Dualies, I've got a brand new, never-before-seen technique for painting, and it's nothing like that other thing. When you're painting for special, you're going to want to paint while panning left or right, such that... Oh, okay, I lied. You got me. It's just the same 4 painting patterns we use for shooters. You figured me out. My B. While all 4 painting patterns are still viable, the nature of Dualies spread fire means that you'll be seeing more gaps than you would for shooters and Splatlings. Unfortunately, there's not really a strategy we can employ to make them paint more cohesively. This is just part and parcel of Dualies as a class. Obviously this isn't a problem for turret mode, but using turret mode regularly for painting is a threat to your longevity, so use it sparingly. Especially if your name is Dowser Dualies. And while you can use all 4 traditional painting patterns, just be wary of how each shot paints when you're trying to main strafe. They tend to land slightly too far to the left or right to be perfectly usable in enemy ink. But you already have a dodge roll for those situations, so it's not that much of a problem. As for zone flipping, there's not really much more to optimize outside of mixing up the 4 painting patterns so as to paint the entire zone as quickly as possible. This will be tougher but more reliable if you can do it from a safe range, so Dualies, Squelchers, and Dowsers should try to be as specific as possible with where their shots land on zone. It's honestly pretty funny to me that every time I bring up the 4 painting patterns, we immediately end up covering a weapon that doesn't care much about using them. That being said, Dapples can still get value out of the painting patterns, especially V-Dapples, but it won't make as much of a difference as it does for weapons with more range and less paint. They'll still be your best options for filling special and traversable paint. Dapples are so ink efficient that it takes legitimate effort to drain the whole ink tank with Dualies alone, which means you can throw almost as many torpedoes as C Jr. does. B-dapples feel similarly when it comes to spamming splat bombs, and considering your special is much less risky to use, you'll benefit more consistently from the ink tank refill it provides. It's also worth noting that turret mode doesn't really paint any better than spread fire, so there's no reason to force yourself into standing still mode whenever you're trying to paint. All 4 painting patterns are viable for default dualies, and they're going to be very useful if your team is running dualies as a paint bot, which is doable, but still kinda odd. Like with dapples, turret mode doesn't make much difference in terms of painting, but if you're in a safe position and you need a bit more precision with your painting, knock yourself out. It can be useful for painting up walls, for example, considering the spread mode is a bit inconsistent in terms of wall paint. All that's left to say is that both subs are phenomenal. Both subs are phenomenal for painting with the first 2 dualie kits, and have plenty of utility besides. For e-dualies, the year is 2025, we have electronic dualies now. Fizzy is exactly what you need to catch up to the competition in terms of paint botting. Use it as often as you can, and in case you didn't know, you can fully charge a Fizzy to fastest by flicking the left stick back and forth violently and simultaneously flicking the right stick up or down. Or you can forego the right stick and you'll still charge it in less time than it takes to full hop. Glugas are the first of the dualies that have slightly different paint in the spread and turret modes. More specifically, turret mode has more range, which applies to the weapon's paint as well. Outside of its range, the paint really isn't all that different. Both modes have the exact same paint per shot, that being 1 spot at max range and 2 droplets randomly placed in between you and your max range. That aside, all 4 painting patterns are viable, but the results are closer to the gals than other shooters, which means the same methods apply. Be precise with your aim when painting lines, and panning slowly left or right beats multiple faster back and forth pans. For dualie squelchers, all 4 painting patterns are viable, but for one key detail. If you pan too quickly left or right, your paint will have a good amount of gaps, so slow down if your goal is traversability. And like many other dualies, there are times when the precision of turret mode is more useful for painting, only for squelchers, you don't feel as much of the vulnerability that others get for being stationary in turret mode. Other than that, this weapon has deceptively high paint output for its range value, and it's worth acknowledging how ink-hungry the weapon is. It's one of the hungriest weapons in the game, especially if you're making regular use of the jump tech. But it helps that all 3 specials give you a free ink tank refill, and that they're low value enough to use whenever you're low on ink. Without the 4 painting patterns, Tetras have pretty sparse paint, but with their high fire rate and some precision, you can make fairly traversable turf. Not that you'll be needing it personally, you'll be dodge rolling out of your ink constantly, and the weapon automatically paints its feet every 5 or 6 shots. When you dodge with Tetras, it shoots a small bit of ink in the opposite direction of your dodge roll. Not enough that it's useful for anything, but it's nice getting a couple free points towards your special given how much this weapon dodge rolls in any given match. You could use the special fill pattern if you desperately need zip or reef slider in the moment, but you don't build special much slower than just playing the weapon to its strengths and running it down. As for the subs, neither sub is overly expensive. Sprinkler is as useful as ever for filling special, even if running it means you're missing out on the combat utility of Autobomb. The paint on Dowser Dualie's spread fire is deceptively bad. I mean, it's clearly on the lower end, but sometimes the paint looks like it might just be enough to make this weapon worth using. It isn't. I still use it though, I like this weapon. Dowsers get so much more value out of the little paint they provide when you're painting with a very specific purpose. Something besides just paint a bunch. For traversable ink, using the up-down pattern to make usable lines for movement is much better than sparse paint placed in a general area. All 4 painting patterns are viable with Dowsers, but the left-right pattern is usually a bit too unfocused to be worth the time and ink cost. This is the only dualie that gets a serious boost to its paint in turret mode. Don't use it when under fire, for obvious reasons, but it's a great play on rollout or when filling specials in a pinch. And you don't have to be too specific with how you paint in turret mode. One normally paced left-right pan will do. Lastly, it's worth mentioning that both kits want you to fill your special as often as possible. With the painting range, this weapon doesn't struggle to get a lot of specials on its own, but there's a catch, and that catch is Burst Bomb. The vanilla kit's ink mines are actually kinda nice with their included white ink frames, but if you're trying to get the most out of sea dowsers, you'll end up using so many burst bombs that you never have enough ink to paint for special. Or your team, for that matter. That's one of the main reasons a kit this insane never sees use, and it's not really something you can work around outside of refusing to use burst bombs everywhere they're applicable. But with ink problems like these, we can at least take comfort in both specials having an instant ink tank refill. But that's all there is to say about dually paint. I know the 4 patterns thing is probably getting old, but that really is all you can do to optimize your paint with these weapons, shy of a couple niche weapon-specific mechanics. If you're sick of these 4 patterns, I'm happy to tell you this is the last you'll be hearing of them in this video. And before we leave them entirely, I swear if you know a better one and you're holding out on me, I'm coming after you. It goes without saying that Brellas are pretty bad at painting, and there's not much you can do to change that. One positive that all Brellas have is that their shots come out quick, and always paint in a straight line ahead of them. Like you already know, Brella paint and bucket paint is very similar, so some of the things from that section apply here as well. Like firing in a way that places most paint per shot diagonally to the left or right of the previous shot. When jumping with Brellas, more of your pellets land at max range than normal, which increases the effective range of your shots, for combat and for painting. There really isn't much to optimize in terms of zones paint across this class. So long as you're using every mechanic your Brella can leverage to paint zone, you'll be putting your best foot forward. And of course, shield launching is a mechanic, but that varies wildly throughout the class, and we'll get into the specifics on the individual level. Brella itself is the reason this class has such a bad reputation for painting. Not to borrow directly from a Prochara video, but the shield can be launched.
Which you shouldn't really do, you're kinda gonna need that.
If you do decide on launching it, you're granted a contender for the worst painting tool in the game. And all it cost was making your weapon objectively worse. Cool. If you hold forward or backwards while turning slightly, you can make the most traversable paint this weapon is capable of producing. For special fill, just paint in a way that causes each shot to land over different turf than the last, nothing else to it. Unfortunately, playing this weapon to its strengths will have you shielding more often than any other Brella, which makes for even less paint. At the very least, you'll keep your feet painted by shielding. Given V-Brella's lackluster paint, if you aren't making good use of Sprinkler, you will never get enough strikes to get anything done. That being said, Brella itself has awful ink efficiency, so for either kit, you'll have to be careful of exactly when you use your subs, and Autobomb's paint isn't really gonna get you anywhere. Even with the increased time between shots, Tent paints so much more in any given match than a default Brella does. Obviously the paint per shot is much higher, and since your strongest option in most situations is launching the shield, you're able to spend a lot less time stuck in place shielding. And when you do launch the shield, it gives you one of the best painting tools in the game. It's slow, which can be a good thing for stalling zones. It leaves enough paint that an entire team can fit behind it. And the tent itself has so much health that it's not going down unless your opponents concentrate their fire or run an object shredder weapon. TLDR, launch the shield as often as you feasibly can, even if it's expensive. Tent's strafe speed isn't bad, but when it shoots, you're slowed down pretty heavily, even if only for a moment. So jumping is a pretty good option to keep yourself moving. For traversable paint, the same pattern we used for default Brella is ideal, but this time, with jumping. Just don't forget that your most traversable ink comes from the tent itself. And for special fill, what's important is making regular use of both your tent's paint and your gun's paint. With the gun, it's as simple as exclusively painting turf that isn't yours and using the bucket's diagonal pattern. It's not new information, but it's the best I can give for tent. The only thing left to say is that this weapon is a little ink hungry, so manage your ink tank carefully. Mines have white ink frames, so you won't take too much of a hit when using them behind your shield. Like the other Brellas, Undercover's paint isn't too impressive. It's definitely more than the others, and you'd be surprised at its overall output when left to its own devices, but in the grand scheme of things, it's still not much paint. Unlike other Brellas, Undercover's shield doesn't paint your feet while it's up. This isn't usually relevant, but if you're being targeted by the right weapons, your mobility can be seriously limited. Luckily, the shots always paint your feet, no matter where they're aimed. Unique mechanics aside, your best paint output is always just firing ahead while strafing left or right. That goes for special fill and traversable ink. To maximize traversability, strafing diagonally left or right makes for less gaps in the ink. All that's left to say is that the subs are great for painting and utility, and Reef Slider, it's Reef Slider. The screen, being an accessibility hazard aside, is an instant ink tank refill, which can be pretty valuable on a weapon that wants to stay in the fight as much as this one does. And you can say the same for Killer Whale, even if you have to trade in your torpedo for something that you get, like, no value out of. At least it'll give you enough points for special that you can pretend Killer Whale was your sub the whole time. Even after the buff, recycled shots are on the lower end of things paint-wise, and while the shield launch does paint a good bit at a good speed, it's pitifully easy for your enemies to delete. Luckily, your shield recharges so fast that having one shield shredded won't impact your paint too heavily. To maximize your special charge, it's important that you use both the main gun's paint and the shield launch every 3 to 4 shots, at least when you can afford it. For more traversable ink, strafe left or right while shooting and don't turn. All that's left to say is that your specials giving you a free ink tank refill comes in handy on a weapon this ink hungry. Like with most other weapons that prioritize fighting, there aren't a lot of tricks to maximizing paint with Brellas. Just play to your weapon's strengths, and when the time comes to paint, shoot your shots and launch your shields. Unless you're one of these two. Like some weapons we've discussed so far, blasters are designed with a purpose, and that purpose isn't painting. Don't refuse to paint outright, but remember that you're one of the strongest weapons in the game when it comes to head-to-head combat. Make slaying your priority in most, but not all situations. This weapon class is also notoriously ink hungry, so keep an eye on your ink tank and be smart with how you use your subs. So I'm gonna go out on a limb and say you already know this, but surely someone out there doesn't know that blasters paint more the closer their blasts are to the ground. And that goes for every single blaster in the game. Luna, Rapid, even Clash, though that one is a very, very small difference. If you really want to split hairs, technically S-Blast's long-ranged mode isn't affected, but the short range does, and I'd say that counts. Blasters tend to paint a clean line straight ahead of them when firing, which is plainly useful for mobility considering its pace. For filling your special meter, try to make sure you don't paint over ink that's already yours, and you'll be putting your best foot forward. If you have a sub that paints, that might just be your safest way of charging it. Every blaster has a kit with a bomb, so if you want to flip a zone by yourself, using your bomb and blaster to get simultaneous burst paint in 2 locations is the best play you've got. But that's really it for class-specific painting details. Before we get into the weapons individually, I'm gonna assume one more thing. That you already know the best times for jumping and staying grounded when you fire. Obviously the airborne accuracy penalty can cost you some shots, but you'll need to jump to keep your positioning strong and to stay moving. When to do one or the other is something you can only learn through experience, so I'll leave that part up to you. Okay, I know I just said it's important that you choose when you are and aren't jumping, but for Luna, just forget I said anything. Jump in every situation you aren't dying to hit a direct in. Your range prevents you from feeling the impact that jump RNG has on the other blasters, so Luna is the fastest 2-shot blaster in terms of fire rate, so if you're safe enough to spam your shots, don't swim in between shots and you'll maximize paint output. Because of Luna's lackluster range, your kits need to do a lot of heavy lifting. Luckily, they're both insane. Make liberal use of either sub and fill that special meter up. Lastly, your ink efficiency is better than any other 2-shot AoE blaster, so I'm sure you know this, but the regular blaster can start swimming after firing way before any other 2-shot AoE blaster does. Even Luna. Abuse this mechanic constantly. There's nothing else to add that isn't kit related, so remember that the first 2 specials are an instant ink tank refill, and Auto Bomb is cheap enough to use regularly, even if it gets like 15 paint per throw. Speaking of instant ink tank refills and spammable subs, everything Range Blaster has that doesn't rhyme with Bracken will work wonders towards your paint output. There's really nothing else I can add here that we didn't cover in general blaster information, so in the interest of not repeating myself constantly, let's move on. Compared to the other blasters, Clash can paint an impressive amount. Compared to any other weapon in the game, Clash struggles to paint. That aside, your best bet for painting in any situation is the slow left-right pan that we covered in the shooters section. Depending on what you need, the speed of your pan should change. Need special? Pan quickly enough that no shot overlaps ink the previous shot painted. Need mobility? Pan slowly enough that your shots leave as few gaps as possible. Lastly, your subs are infinitely useful, and both specials are instant ink tank refills. For both kits, you want that special filled as often as reasonably possible, even for chumps, which might be less valuable, but are easily Clash's best painting tool. In terms of painting patterns, I'd say the same ones that apply to Clash are viable for Rapid Blaster. You can also try the bucket diagonal pattern, but you might need to swim in between shots to properly place the paint from your blasts. Because of the high fire rate, rapids will inherently be causing more blasts than other blasters. If you aim low, the overall difference in paint output will surprise you. At this point, we've talked about ink mines and torpedoes so much that you know pretty much everything I have to say about them. That aside, this is our first weapon that makes solid use of the rolled torpedo combo. The 14 paint that provides isn't much, but it might be enough to cap off your special or stop an enemy player in their tracks. For Rapid Pro, your painting patterns are exactly the same as they were for Rapid Blaster, only with slower shots and more range. With Pro specifically, a majority of your paint per shot is placed in the line your shots leave behind. If your goal is to paint, make sure your shots are traveling as far as they can. However, your first two subs are worthless for painting. More than that, the ink cost hits your uptime hard with little to no benefit, so unless you've got like a guaranteed dart combo lined up, I'd recommend against using them. Just as well, the instant ink tank refill you get from Killer Whale and Cooler go a long way for a weapon that demands as much uptime as this one does, and we all know what an instant ink tank refill means for a weapon with lethal bombs. For S-Blast, it goes without saying that your jump shots heavily outpaint your grounded ones, but unlike most blasters, this means you're only really painting well at close range, which invites a lot of risk. This makes slaying even more of a priority, because if the enemies are alive and nearby, they'll be targeting you the moment you step out of position. That being said, you have the perfect kits for a weapon that struggles to paint outside of its range. Sprinkler is Sprinkler, and Burst Bomb is just cheap enough that you can use it as one of your primary painting tools. If you're safe enough to paint with the S-Blast itself, your best bet for usable paint is moving forward and turning slightly between shots. If you're precise enough, you'll leave little to no space in between bursts of paint. In terms of filling special, the obvious answer of don't let yourself cover the turf the previous shot covered is still the best answer. And while you don't use the long-range mode for painting, a straight clean line is still a viable escape plan. Lastly, I know we've talked a lot about prioritizing slaying over painting with blasters, but more than any other blaster, your specials are pivotal to the success of your team. Make sure you're getting enough of them. But that's everything there is to say about painting with blasters. I know it isn't much, but that's just the nature of an entire weapon class being dedicated to slaying over painting. I hope at the very least that something I said in that section was worth the watch.
Otherwise, I've wasted your time. And I'm sorry.
Your main concern when painting with brushes is not painting over spots you've already turned. So for each brush, the question becomes, how many times should I pull the trigger before turning or moving on? Just as well, every single swing of the brush is heavily impacted by RNG. Don't be surprised if 10 flicks in the same spot outright fails to cover one tiny patch of turf ahead of you. Jumping will also be incredibly relevant for each brush, but in completely different ways that we'll cover for each weapon. Keep in mind, brushes are at their most vulnerable when they're mashing or jumping, considering you lose all your movement options when committing to either. You don't need to think particularly hard about adequately placing your paint with ink brush. Just point and mash, then it's obvious when you've fully covered the space in front of you. If you want an exact number of flicks before you've fully covered the space ahead, it's either 4 or 5 depending on the RNG. If you're fighting for zone control, you have essentially the highest paint output per second in the game. Just keep in mind you're extremely vulnerable when you're committing to mashing for several seconds, so pick your moments wisely. The thing about jumping with ink brush is that it's kind of a double-edged sword. It can let you move in on an enemy while attacking, or reposition slightly while mashing, but being in the air inherently prevents you from rolling away, which might come back to bite you if your opponent is just out of range or ready for your approach. Just note that jumping doesn't really add anything to your paint with ink brush, you strictly use it for fighting and repositioning. Unlike the other brushes, ink brush has a strafe speed that's worth utilizing. Use it for painting, chasing enemies, micro-movement, and pretty much any situation you aren't actively being targeted in. Your kits are less about painting and more about enabling or enhancing your main weapon, but you'll find that these subs work wonders when you have ink brush level mobility.
Did you notice that every single ink brush clip of mine came from one game? I can't play this weapon for more than 5 minutes.
Unlike the other two brushes, Octobrush's angle dramatically impacts where your ink lands. If you're aiming exclusively straight ahead, it might take 7 or 8 flicks before you fully covered the area immediately in front of you. We can do better.
By panning from top to bottom or vice versa, we can cover the ground ahead in 3 to 4 flicks depending on the RNG. The 4 angles to aim for, considering dead ahead to be 0 degrees, are 30 degrees, 0, -30, and -60. I know that sounds oddly specific, but you'll get a feel for it pretty quickly. Every single one of your flicks is heavily influenced by RNG. One flick will place 5 droplets of paint dead ahead, and always within a V shape stretching out in front of you. Jumping does a lot for Octobrush's paint and mobility, even if it takes away your option to roll on out of there. A short hop lasts exactly as long as it takes you to swing twice, and a full hop is similar with 3 swings. The former is ideal for personal mobility or moving through enemy ink, and the angles you'll want to use are -30 and -60. For the latter, your full hop actually lasts a bit longer than 3 swings, but not so long that you can get a 4th out while staying airborne. I'd recommend using the 4th swing when you're safe enough to live through a bit of end lag, or if you're focusing on paint coverage. With the 3 flick full hop, your angles are 0, -30, and -60 degrees. Octobrush isn't fully immobile when you're standing and swinging, but your strafe speed leaves a lot to be desired, so I don't really recommend making regular use of it. If you need to paint a zone, alternating your aim between spots every 3 or 4 flicks will be your best way of impacting it. Just try not to overexpose yourself when you're focused on painting.
Lastly, it's worth mentioning how all 3 kits ask you to play the weapon completely differently.
Noctobrush, the Nocturnal Brush, wants you to focus on painting and team play, whereas the vanilla kit gives you tools that make V-Brush a more effective slayer.
And then there's E-Brush, which has the perfect kit for a more run-and-gun playstyle, with a special that keeps it alive and forces enemies out of position. While all 3 kits have tools that benefit your painting power,
the Nouveau kit specs fully into the support playstyle, where it becomes very important to know the specifics of Octobrush's paint and positioning. Paintbrush is another weapon that doesn't have much going on under the hood in terms of maximizing your paint output. For maximum paint coverage, turn in between your swings such that every subsequent flick leaves half its paint on the turf your previous flick covered. For filling special, the obvious answer is the best answer. Turn enough after each flick that you never cover the same spot twice, and that's the same thing I'd recommend for zone control. While your flicks do change slightly depending on your angle, Paintbrush paint is extremely solid and leaves little to no gaps when you swing at the angle for maximum range, that being straight ahead. Considering how long your swing's startup is, jumping is always a good idea. If you're short hopping, you'll always land before you even start swinging, which mitigates most of the downsides being airborne normally invites. Even if you're full hopping, you'll typically land right after the first swing ends. In terms of strafe speed, you basically have none. Don't try it. Repositioning is Paintbrush's biggest handicap when it comes to painting. Once you've painted the immediate area, you need to move up, which means going through the wind-up animation again and again and again throughout any given match. Would you believe me if I told you that this entire video exists to make it easier for people to pick up Octobrush? When I picked up the weapon, it took me way too long to figure out the best methods for painting and keeping mobile. Hopefully this video saved someone else from that fate. Shoutouts to Red Shell for having enough high-level Octobrush VODs that I wasn't stuck figuring this out on my own for weeks on end.
You'd think a weapon that doesn't even require aiming would be the most straightforward painter out of any weapon in the game. And yet, it's the weapon I've ended up rambling about for the longest in the entire video.
This isn't the first time we've covered this concept, but especially with Tri-Stringer and Reflux, you'll usually have to choose between firing at enemies and maximizing your paint output. This kinda goes for Wellstring as well, but instead of strictly getting less paint the longer you charge, your charges get one of these effectiveness curves over time, at least in terms of paint. On the same topic, all bows have a much higher paint per second with tap shots than any other level of charge. And because of the non-existent white ink frames, they practically never run out of ink if they're swimming between shots. And of course, jumping while aiming upwards can land all your bolts in the same place, even if your bolts would otherwise be spread out. This limits your paint output, yes, but it maximizes your damage potential, meaning there's yet another situation where you have to choose between paint and DPS. Though it's a nice way to paint a straight line in a pinch. There's also an odd quirk that the bolts have that's worth knowing. They'll go from flying at their maximum speed to pretty much falling straight down as soon as they reach their maximum range. This goes for mid charges and full charges, so if you're cheesing enemies behind walls, this is always worth keeping in mind. Not so much for painting, but I still thought you should know if you didn't already. Since the bolts paint before and after exploding, they make a great tool for stalling a zone. And here's your virtually useless bit of tech for this weapon class. If your charged or partial charged shots hit the ground before reaching their maximum range, the impact will spray a good amount of ink past where the shots landed.
This is true for shooters, Splatlings, and some other weapons as well, but it's especially noticeable with stringers, considering how much more paint it adds and the multiple projectiles hitting the floor at once.
For Tri-Stringer itself, it's obvious that your best method for maximizing paint and filling your special is tap shots. But that's not playing the weapon to its strengths. When you charge fully from the backline and safely maximize your damage potential, the best you get is a thin, straight line. So one might think the healthy middle ground is prioritizing one-ringed charge shots, since it gives you a decent paint at a solid tempo while still getting access to the AoE bolts. But the midline position that forces you into is a very risky place for Tri-Stringer to be. That makes you easy to rush down, and Stringer is god-awful in close quarters combat. With all that in mind, I think it becomes clear that 90% of your time should be spent going for full charges, and the other 10% is tap shotting for personal mobility or filling special. There is one particularly notable exception. If you can safely make it near zone but not on top of a zone, your one-ringed charge paints a decent amount, and the delay on the bolts exploding is a tough thing to outpaint consistently. But back to tap shots, you'll paint most traversibly using the diagonal alternating pattern we discussed for buckets, and special fill is the same as ever, just don't paint the same spot twice. This is why Sprinkler is such a good fit for Tri-Stringer. There really isn't a better tool for painting if your weapon can't paint while fighting, and your ink efficiency isn't particularly bad, so you can justify throwing a lot of them. And of course, specials with a free ink tank refill are always a good thing to have.
While Ebo loses out on the instant ink tank refills, it ups the kill potential by a significant margin. Ebo is probably the most fun of any Tri-Stringer kit, but it struggles to keep pace with Inkline in terms of paint. I can't strictly recommend one kit over the other, but if your team badly needs paint support, you're doing them a disservice by leaving Chump Bow in the dust. With Reflux, it goes without saying that your tap shots are a contender for the best painting tool in the game. There's not much to optimize shy of properly managing your uptime. It is worth saying that your tap shots can leave some small patches unpainted between you and the main burst of paint. If that's bothering you, just make another left-right pass with your angle pointed lower or higher than the previous pass. The difference between normal tap shots and jumping tap shots is surprisingly close in terms of paint, but I'd still recommend grounded tap shots thanks to the mobility and immediate access to refilling your ink tank. That'll be your best method for traversable ink, whereas special fill can't be optimized further than spamming tap shots and trying not to paint the same spot twice. And I can't imagine a more effective way of painting zones. Unfortunately, your jumping and grounded charge shots don't paint a clean line, but if you tap even once after the charge shot, you can fill in those gaps perfectly. And of course, main strafing is perfectly viable for personal mobility. In terms of kits, we somehow found ourselves in a position where V-Flux is being dethroned in terms of pick rate. Never thought I'd see the day. Not that I blame anyone for their choices. You know everything Torp can do, and Booyah provides more consistent paint than missiles while adding to your survivability, so it's very much worth running this kit whether or not you can hit your shots.
All that's left to say is that Curling Bomb is still amazing as ever. Use it for painting and mobility where applicable. Unlike the other two bows, Wellstring can paint a ton through combat. Granted, you'll be limiting your paint output a bit when you do a jump shot, but the one-shot potential usually makes that worth it. Jumping with a charge shot also paints a clean line to move through, and you can fire immediately after jumping to get a curved line for more specific ink paths for your team's mobility. It takes about twice as long to fill your special with charged shots as opposed to tap shots, but charged shots still place a ton of paint from a safe distance. Combine that with the combat utility that chip damage provides, and it's obvious what you should be doing most of the time. To be clear, I'd recommend full charges for everything from painting zones to turfing. If you can safely tap shot on zone, go for it, but those opportunities get much more scarce the better your opponents are. Considering you'll be moving closer and closer to your opponents to maximize pressure, you might find yourself in a pretty dangerous position more often than not. Since your pressure and paint bring a lot to your team, staying alive is a priority. Use your sticky traps and one-shot directs to keep yourself from getting rushed down, and try not to overextend. When painting for your team, you can make the ink from subsequent charge shots more traversable by holding forward and turning slightly in between shots. Specifically so the paint left by your line of explosions connects with the previous shot's explosions. And of course, an ink tank refill special goes a long way on any weapon that spends a lot of time charging. But that's bows done and dusted. It's another one of those situations where you have to choose between painting and fighting. Only this time, there's a wild difference in paint output between the tap shots and charge shots. How often you should use your tap shots varies pretty heavily between all three bows, but if you use them at the right times, you should be able to get a ton of paint while staying perfectly combat worthy.
But, now that we've covered the Sticky Bomb launcher, it's time to look into Demoman's other playstyle.
One thing all swords have in common is that their best paint per second comes from spamming horizontal slashes. And while charge slashes have less paint per second, that's usually made up for by their utility. Swords aren't the only weapon class with a charge mechanic, but they are the only ones who charge so fast that the time lost is completely negligible. Because of the ways jumping gives you mobility while charging, I'll usually have some advice on how to use it for each weapon. Just know that full hops always last longer than your charge, and squid rolls are always full hops, so don't use them if you need to keep the pressure up. All swords have little to no whiting frames, with the only exception being Stamper's Charge Slash, which even so doesn't have many. Like some other weapons, if your shots hit the ground before reaching their maximum range, they'll paint a wider area at the end of the line. But for swords, the difference is greater than any other weapon class in the game. Add jumping into the mix, and you can practically hit your max range and get the extra paint at the end. Just know that this only applies to horizontal slashes, and yes, that means both slashes with Toothbrush. Closer to Splatoon 3's release, Sword Charge Slash was one of the best painting tools in the game. A dozen or so patches later, and it's still a viable option for paint. But in terms of paint per second and ink efficiency, it's pretty badly outclassed by horizontal slashes. Currently, Charge Slash is still your best option for traversable paint and long distance paint. For everything else, I'd recommend horizontals. It isn't worthless to go for the extra paint you get from aiming low, but it's not going to make too big of a difference for Sword. Up to you whether it's worth using or not. A short hop lasts exactly as long as it takes to charge, and fire your charge slashes, so you can comfortably use them repeatedly for repositioning. Just note that the charge alone is quicker than the short hop is, so you won't be able to dash on frame 1 of a full charge. With Sword, I'd recommend short hopping over grounded strafing, but that's not a binary recommendation. You still strafe fairly quickly with this weapon, so don't be afraid to stay grounded on occasion. Since your Charge Slash is a relatively slow projectile, it can be used to contest the paint from strikes or Booyah Bomb and stall a zone. To maximize this effect, aim upwards so the ink trail stays over the same area for longer. That's all there is to say about painting with Sword, but I can't move on until I acknowledge ink efficiency. Especially with your Charge Slashes, you'll run out of ink insanely fast. Doubly so if you're throwing burst bombs. Sword has decent paint, but there will inevitably be times where your ink tank is better spent on fighting and applying pressure. This is especially relevant for your Zip Caster, which ends as soon as you run out of ink. While you can use Zip to paint, and it's worth using it during the last 5 seconds of a turf war, I wouldn't recommend it in any other situation. You're the only viable Zip user in the game. You can kill anyone. Do it! Go! One weak slash with Wiper doesn't paint much more than a short, straight line. But combine that with this weapon's frame data, and you get a weapon with an absurd level of paint output. Granted, all that paint is pretty much exclusive to your horizontal slashes, but it's still pretty crazy paint. While both of the other swords have verticals with painting utility, Wiper's is essentially only viable for combat. So for special fill, traversable ink, and zone flipping, spamming horizontal flicks while strafing left or right is your best means of painting. With the other Splatanas, I typically recommend using jumps to reposition while charging, but Wiper's charge is so fast that you won't feel vulnerable charging when grounded. If you were to jump, your jump lasts much longer than your charge time, so if you do jump, you'll likely get stuck in the air and unable to dash for some time. On the same note, your strafe speed in between slashes is crazy enough that jumping won't make a positive difference unless you're over enemy ink. So everyone knows the strafe speed while slashing is crazy, but you keep the same strafe speed while charging, and even while charged. To me, that's just another reason to avoid jumping wherever you can help it.
Just don't interpret that as me saying never jump.
In stark contrast to Sword, Wiper has fantastic ink efficiency, meaning you can throw so many torpedoes and you won't be feeling it in your ink tank.
Or curling bombs, but that might be a bit less useful in a combat situation. That being said, you'd be surprised how useful curling is for this weapon in terms of utility. It gives you a consistent way out of any situation without demanding that you stop slashing at your enemies, and all you need is a little bit of ink in the tank.
With Toothbrush, your weak slashes are a contender for the best painting tool in the entire game. They're quick, the paint is thick, they'll be your best bet in every situation where turfing is the goal. But if your goal is painting for special instead of turfing, slashes aimed slightly towards the ground paint a good deal more for Toothbrush. I'd recommend using them when possible, but not so much that it becomes a priority. Like with Sword, your Charge Slash shoots such a slow projectile that you can paint over things like Bria Bomb and Tri-Strike better than Sword ever could. And just like Sword, you can stall further by aiming the Charge Slash upwards. Your charges are slightly faster than a short hop, so it's not such a bad idea to use them for extra repositioning. Just remember that you won't be able to dash in the same frame that you land. You can still fully charge a slash before landing, but the slashing animation itself takes so long it can be risky. Since it takes so long though, you can use a full hop or squid roll before charging without inviting too much additional risk. Lastly, just like with N-Zap, your main weapon has such good paint that Suction Bomb will serve you better for combat than painting. And that's it! You now know everything I know about painting optimally. Obviously, considering we're at the end, I believe I've covered everything there is to cover on this topic, and I hate to say it again, but if you know any secret weapon painting tech that I didn't mention here, I hope you'll let me know in the comments. I hate not knowing things. Give me the secrets.
If you made it this far, thank you. One thing you might have noticed is that all the PvP footage in today's video was recorded in Turf War. I have a couple reasons. One of them being that I suck with chargers and it wouldn't feel right bringing them into the ranked modes when I'm a hindrance to any team I'm on if I'm using them. But more than that, I've never really invested in Splatoon's ranked modes, so I thought it'd be fun to record the process of climbing from C- to X rank and turn it into a couple road to ranked videos or streams. Unfortunately, this video was so large that I ran out of hard drive space across 3 hard drives. If you're watching this video, you can be certain of one thing. Now that it's uploaded, I'm recording the beginning of my ranked climb as we speak. If that kind of content sounds interesting to you, I hope you'll keep an eye out for those uploads in the future. But that's all there is to say. Hopefully this was worth the watch and didn't just drone on for an hour and a half, listing a bunch of common knowledge like it was novel information. I know this is 2 out of 2 videos on this channel, and simultaneously 2 out of 2 videos about painting. I seem to talk about it like every stream, but I come from other team-based shooters with similar mechanics like TF2, so I spend a lot of time trying to internalize Splatoon's mechanics that I'm not natively used to, ink being first and foremost. Luckily, I can say with certainty that the next video is about Splatlings, so if you've been looking to get into that weapon class, I hope you'll push however many buttons it takes to see that video when it comes out. Cause I love me some Splatlings. Nope, that's not it. Oh, okay, try again. You know what, good enough. But that'll be it for me. Thanks for watching. If you want more from me, I stream like 3 to 4 times a week at twitch.tv/mumphdot, so stop by if you want to see me playing Splatoon or like Dark Souls or something. VODs go here, other stuff goes here, and that's all I've got. Thanks again for watching. I'm gonna go jump off this boat now.